Welcome to the NBA Slate Breakdown. I'm Jason Gilbo at JGilbo11. Taking a look at tonight's 8-game slate on FanDuel and DraftKings. Just 8 games. We got a lot of kind of high-priced guys tonight. It's not looking like a really bottom-heavy slate where we get a ton of value on unless stuff opens up throughout the day. Definitely there are a couple games that we want to target. We got that Cleveland-Indiana game at 218. Denver-Orlando at 218 as well. And obviously you have Golden State in play tonight too with no Curry. We're obviously watching the Anthony Davis news as well. So kind of a lot to circulate throughout the day here. We'll jump into this Denver-Orlando game. Obviously, the bigger kind of injury news here is that Evan Fournier is out the next few games here for Orlando. That shapes things up a little bit differently for Orlando. We know that Nikola Jokic is going to be out here tonight. So obviously, we're kind of dealing with a similar front court, as the previous few nights. When we look at this game, obviously definitely one that I want to get a piece of. Some of these values have come up in price, so they're not quite as strong as values as they were maybe a week or two ago. On this Denver side, obviously, when you look at Orlando, they're a bad rebounding team, ranked 27th in rebound differential. Definitely like targeting centers, like targeting power forwards against Orlando. In that case, I don't mind looking at the 3 here. Obviously, Mason Plumlee is going to be a guy who draws the start tonight. Got a little bit of foul trouble last time against Boogie. We saw Fareed get in foul trouble as well. That's kind of where we saw Trey Lyles pick up the extra minutes. I definitely don't mind all 3. I think Lyles has obviously earned more playing time, and he's going to get into this mix a little bit more, which does concern me kind of for the other 2 and really the 3 in general. But Lyles is obviously cheap enough to kind of take a shot on. Fareed's price has come up. Plumlee's is still decent. The problem is there's quite a few center options on this slate where I think Plumlee is probably best suited for over on DraftKings. I think Plumlee is a little bit of a reach on FanDuel because I think this is a position that you want to at least get some exposure to some of these top guys that, like Kevin Love, Vucevic, obviously DeMarcus Cousins, if Davis sits, is going to be in a prime spot against his old team. So for me, I'm definitely looking at those guys. I think we can continue to target them. The backcourt is going to continue to ride a lot of Gary Harris, Will Barton. Gary Harris is kind of getting up there in price a little bit, but he's been playing really well. Same goes with Will Barton, obviously coming off a dud game, but we can continue to look at these guys. I don't have a lot of interest in Hernan Gomez or Wilson Chandler, who are kind of splitting time and working themselves in. Jamal Murray is obviously going to be a guy you can take a look at. I know I mentioned him on the other day with the pod with Brent here, and he was like in the usage. Obviously, he's pretty much just a scorer. If he can get some peripheral stats, then he'll be fine. He's cheap enough to kind of look at here. He's only 5,700, 6K on FanDuel. Fantasy points per minute, under 0.9 this year. It's not great, but the usage is obviously going to be there, especially without Jokic. We know that this Denver offense is going to, funnel through a lot of other guys. So with the total that they still have tonight, 108, it's definitely a game that we want to target, but not really looking at anyone else outside of those names. On the Orlando side, took a look into some guys without Fournier on the court. Aaron Gordon, Vucevic, Jonathan Simmons, all over a 30% usage rate. So those are kind of the 3 that I'm really looking to target. I don't have a ton of interest in guys like DJ Augustine, Shelvin Mack, who may pick up some extra minutes, Aaron Aflalo, turning back the clock there. It's not really that appealing for me. I guess they could be worthy punts, whoever draws the start. But once again, I'm more looking to the surrounding cast here. Gordon's obviously a guy I think at a pretty weaker power forward position tonight, unless you're playing on DraftKings where you have some position eligibility. Gordon's expensive. I think a lot of people are going to shy away from him, but he has that type of upside, especially in this spot. Denver 29th against a position, 26th in defensive efficiency. I think when we look at this, obviously Denver's a much lesser tough front court with Jokic off the floor. So going to be looking at those guys. And obviously Vucevic is a guy that I do like here tonight. Obviously going to be tough to use, him over a Cousins, if Anthony Davis does play. So do note that as a kind of, hints coming in. But he's also pretty cheap. He's shown huge upside before. 1.21 fantasy points per minute this year. Like I said, that huge usage. The matchup is not, it's better than it was maybe 2 weeks ago with Jokic on the floor. So definitely going to be looking at him tonight. And really, I think you can look at Elfrid Payton. Didn't have that great of a game last time out. He's still fairly cheap. DK, that is. He's a little expensive for me on FanDuel, but he's a guy that I do have some interest in as well tonight. So look at that game and target quite a bit of. A lot of good mid-range game guys in that one that has a potential shootout. So going to head and go ahead there. Chicago and Charlotte next year, 203 total, one of the lower ones on the night. Charlotte 9-point favorites. Don't have a lot of interest in the Chicago side. I will be looking at Chris Dunn here. Charlotte, middle of the road against point guards this year. Dunn's obviously a guy who can rack up peripheral stats. The usage rate has been there. Fantasy points per minute just a shade over 1 this season. So as long as he can stay out of foul trouble and play 30 minutes, he's going to be fine. 6,700 on FanDuel, not a bad price tag. 58 on DraftKings. That's kind of where I'm really looking to use him. Obviously, you have some other guys in that range, like a Rajon Rondo, who we can continue to look at too. But Dunn's obviously probably the most intriguing, especially if you're kind of playing in correlation with these guys. But outside of that, I mean, I don't have a ton of interest in Justin Holiday here tonight. He's a little bit expensive for my taste on this slate. Denzel Valentine's the guy you can look at here. Still fairly cheap. He's below 5,500 on both sites. Continue to kind of look his way. The front court in a pretty tough spot here tonight. Charlotte's been pretty decent. They're obviously a decent rebounding team, fifth. And obviously I don't really like taking centers against Dwight Howard, so Robin Lopez is pretty much out of play for me here. On the Charlotte side, I have some interest in Kemba Walker. The problem is obviously when you look at the point guard position tonight, we don't have Curry. So I kind of like at this mid-range a little bit more just because I'd see myself paying for a Durant, a LeBron, a Cousins tonight. So I don't know how much I'll be jamming in Kemba. So for me, excellent GPP option. I'm going to stick with that mid-range in terms of cash. But obviously Kemba is very much in play here. Usage rate, 27% this year. Chicago, not a great team at all. They're 25th in defensive efficiency against point guards. As far as the other guys go here, Nicholas Batum's a guy we can look at. Still fairly cheap across the industry. He just cracked 6K. He's been playing a little bit better of late. Good spot here against a team that's ranked 23rd against shooting guards this season. I don't have a lot of interest in Michael Kidd-Gilchrist. I don't have a lot of interest in some of the front court guys here. Dwight Howard, I like a little bit more centers around him. I think this is going to be kind of a slower pace, grinded out type game for both sides. So I'm really not picking a ton of guys from this one. Golden State and Detroit here next, 213 total. Obviously, with Curry off the floor, we see usage bumps go for Klay Thompson, obviously Kevin Durant, both coming off very strong games. Not going to go too much into detail here. Obviously, Klay Thompson in a tough matchup against Avery Bradley. A little bit of a concern there for me at his price tag, but willing to look his way. Obviously, Kevin Durant's the guy that we're going to continue to look at. 35% usage rate with Curry off the floor. We saw the 35% usage rate last game. Completely went off against Charlotte. Definitely a guy I'm going to be building around. It's always tough because LeBron's kind of right there in price now, although we're looking at about $1,000 difference. But LeBron's in a prime spot tonight against Indiana. Draymond Green is probable for tonight's game. I definitely will be looking at him, especially in some GPPs, because I will be kind of going in that mid-range as well at the position. So clear guys that are in play obviously are the starters, but when we look at kind of the secondary players, and I'm going to use last game as a little bit of an example here, we saw Steve Kerr roll out a ton of guys, a lot of guys at the position. We saw Quinn Cook, we saw Sean Livingston play, Patrick McCaw, I believe, is ruled out for tonight. So these types of things, we saw Andre Iguodala, who was the only bench guy to really play 30 minutes last game. Still not a high usage, but went in and produced. He's a cheap guy. I think you're obviously going to trust him the most. It's hard to really look at anyone else. Obviously, Jordan Bell's going to move back to the bench spot with Draymond Green, not play as many minutes. So this is a spot where obviously you can look at the starters. I think Andre Iguodala is really the best bench play out of this group here. So on the Pistons side of things, you can look at guys like Reggie Jackson, who's fairly cheap on this slate. 5,800 on FanDuel, 5,800 on DK. Not a bad option here. Probably a guy who's going to get you right around 25, 30 fantasy points. It's probably about a ceiling here. I think the guy that I have the most interest in, and it's weird to say, is Tobias Harris. Put up a dud last time out. Obviously going to deal with Draymond Green. For Detroit to keep this game close, I think Harris is obviously the guy that this offense really has to flow through. I could potentially see that Andre Drummond gets played out a little bit in this one. At his higher price tags, he's kind of off my radar for cash games. GPPs, Drummond's always worth a shot. Potential, game where he can log 20-20 if he gets in there and stays, and the game kind of flows around him. That's going to be the thing that kind of keeps him in the game. Otherwise, we've seen kind of Golden State go a little bit smaller, play quicker, and kind of take opposing centers off the court. So that is one concern for me tonight, but definitely don't mind him in GPPs. As usual, Detroit doesn't really have a ton of bench guys that I have a lot of interest in. Ish Smith was always kind of the only one, but on this slate, I'm not really seeing the appeal here. So moving on, Cleveland, Indiana. This is a game that I definitely love to get exposure to tonight. 218 total. You look at Cleveland. 111 implied total. This is going to be a game where obviously LeBron and Kevin Love are going to draw a lot of interest from everyone here. It's a great spot. Indiana is one of the poor defenses in the league. We've seen obviously Oladipo play some solid defense here, but LeBron's just kind of a different animal. When we look at Kevin Love, prime spot here. Indiana, not a great rebound team. They're 19th. Obviously, bottom 5 in defensive efficiency against centers. That's where Love kind of steps up. He's expensive. He's not playing a ton of minutes, but obviously 1.22 fantasy points per minute this year against a really bad team against centers. Like, we can definitely look to take a shot. But outside of that, I mean, it's kind of hard to kind of get excited about some of these peripheral guys here. I mean, you can look at J.R. Smith. I mean, once again, he's going to be around the 30-minute mark. He's not a great fantasy points per minute guy. Shouldn't draw the Oladipo defense, so that's a bonus for him. Brent discussed that the other day on the pod. So at his price, I mean, 4,400, 3,900 DK, you could do worse with punting options. I know Aaron Aflalo is likely the guy who steps into the lineup who's going to be pretty close to bare min that you could look at if you're going stars and scrubs, because there isn't a ton of options on this slate. So definitely going to be looking at those guys. Outside of that, not much that I'm going to be bothering with for Cleveland. On the Indiana side, Victor Oladipo should probably get a little bit overlooked tonight because of his higher price tags. Not a lot of people are going to go that way and pay his price. So if you're kind of looking at game stack this one, I think this was obviously interesting. Still, Cleveland, better on defense of late during their winning streak, but still not one that I'm shying away from. So we're going to be looking at guys like Darren Collison, who's still fairly cheap, Victor Oladipo, who's cheap. Bogdanovich is an interesting guy at the small forward position where there's not a ton of value on this slate. And then the front court, I still think Thaddeus Young playing heavy minutes is a guy you can look at in this front range. 6,200 on FanDuel, 6K on DraftKings. Guy who's playing 33 minutes per game this year, 0.86 fantasy points per minute. It's not a bad spot. I think we can continue to look at Young. Turner's a little bit out of play. He's questionable, could be injured here. I'm kind of staying away right now in a little bit of a tougher spot here with Kevin Love kind of moving around quite a bit. It takes some rebounds out of his name. Moving forward, I got Sacramento and New Orleans. We have a potential Boogie revenge game here with no Anthony Davis, but we need to keep an eye on the Davis news. I think that makes much more guys in play outside of Boogie. I think Boogie obviously becomes a clear-cut pay-up option if Davis is out. Same goes for Rajon Rondo. We've seen him play really well with Davis off the floor. Obviously, he has a rapport with Boogie. So I think we can continue to look at those two. Obviously, Etuan Moore is a guy who has stepped up and played well. I think he's going to be once again in play for me here at this spot. Him pretty much step in. So that's kind of where the mid-range sub 5K guys are coming from, because outside of that, there's not a lot that you really want to be rostering on tonight's slate outside of kind of those few names. So keep an eye on that one. That's going to be a big one. That one's pretty straightforward. So, if Davis doesn't play, obviously Rondo, Moore, and Boogie are obviously guys that we need to be looking at. If Davis does play, they kind of come more secondary plays for me. Usage comes back in. It kind of comes down for Boogie just a little bit. It's still really high, but at those price tags, it becomes a little bit tough to pay. But obviously with the revenge factor, we know Boogie hasn't forgotten it. So that's one thing that we need to look at. As far as Sacramento goes, not a ton of interest here. Zach Randolph in a little bit of a muddy front court. If Cousins does play, he obviously doesn't play much defense, which bodes well for him. The front court is still kind of a mess. The back court is still a lot of kind of average usage rates going around with average minutes. So, sorry, Kings really just not on my radar, despite a decent matchup against some of these guys. So going to be out of play for me tonight. I'm going to be looking other directions, so not really on my radar. Dallas, Milwaukee, quite a bit in this game to kind of look at. Dallas, obviously a team, struggles on the defensive side. We've also seen Dennis Smith, be a little bit banged up here. If Smith sits, obviously J.J. Barea becomes a much better value. I still have a lot of interest in J.J. Barea anyway. We've seen the usage rate, over 25% over the last 10 games. It's averaging over 1 fantasy points per minute this year. playing right around 22, 23 minutes. So I think that's kind of where we want out of him. He's below 5K on both sides. We can continue to look his way. And obviously, if Smith's out, he becomes a much better player, one of the more important staples to your lineup moving forward. Wesley Matthews hasn't been a great fantasy points per minute guy this year. It's 0.63. Still playing a lot of minutes, 34 this season. He is a cheap punt if you need it. I don't love it just because it's Wesley Matthews. He doesn't have a ton of production, but a guy who can find 20 to 25 fantasy points if you're kind of going stars and scrubs is in play for me. The same goes for Harrison Barnes, but he's actually been a better fantasy points per producer. We talk about him all the time. He's a great minutes player. Milwaukee does struggle against wings, so we can continue to look at Harrison Barnes, especially in this mid-range, especially if you don't want to pay the LeBron James, Kevin Durant. If you're going boogie, you're trying to go balanced. Obviously, I think when we look at Jonathan Simmons and Harrison Barnes are the two small forwards that stand out to me the most, kind of in that 6K range. So as far as the front court goes, we've seen Kleber play really well. But I think obviously he's a guy that we need to look at for very cheap, 3,600, 3,400. It's not a bad spot here against a Milwaukee team that's dead last in rebounding. They do struggle against bigs, so I think we can look at both them and Dirk as kind of the value options at this position. So this is definitely one that I want some exposure to. So Dallas in play for me tonight. They kind of bring the most value to the table. When we look at Milwaukee, obviously it's Giannis, but kind of a hard competition tonight with LeBron in that spot against Indy. Also Durant on his own without Curry. But never going to say no to Greek Freak. Priced down 11K. It's a little expensive for me on FanDuel at 12.4. But we can definitely look his way in GPPs if you're building multiple lineups. The guy I actually have the most interest in from that game is Eric Bledsoe. Dennis Smith Jr., not a great defender. His price is still reasonable, $7,300 on FanDuel, $6,700 on DraftKings, averaging right around 32 fantasy points per game, 1.08 fantasy points per minute. I mean, this is a really good spot against a team that's been pretty poor against point guards this season. So overall, he's probably going to be a guy that I plug in the most from this Milwaukee side. And I think outside that, it's really going to be John Henson. You can take a shot on Tony Snell if you're going stars and scrubs, but John Henson's the one I have the most interest in. 25th in rebounding this year. Against centers, they've been really poor, allowing a ton of production. They just don't really have anyone to kind of contend with Henson. If you can get those blocked shots in, pick up some rebounds and some easy putbacks. Obviously he's going to hit value at his price tags. Fairly cheap on both sides. He's one that I do have a lot of interest in on this slate. He's only 4,500 on DK, so I definitely will be looking his way. Moving forward here, Toronto-Memphis. This is the game I don't have a ton of interest in. Two kind of teams that play a little bit slower. Two teams that are defensively minded. Toronto, obviously you can look at Kyle Lowry here in this spot because there are a lack of pay-up point guard options. But like I said, I do like the Dunn, Bledsoe, Rondo, Collison type tier a little bit better. But he's going to be low-owned in GPPs. We know the upside's there. With Mike Conley out, obviously it's a little bit easier of a matchup. DeMar DeRozan, don't have a ton of interest in his price tag at the position. He's not going to be someone that I build around here tonight. And as far as the front court goes, I just don't have a lot of interest. We saw Ibaka obviously pop off against the Suns. You can look his way. If you can get 25 minutes, he should obviously be able to produce, but it's not really a great spot for this Toronto side. And obviously on the Memphis side, no real interest here for me. You can take a shot on Tyreek Evans and GPPs just because obviously he's coming off just high usage. It's really him and Gasol running the show here. Outside of that, you shouldn't really have a ton of interest in this game. Boston, San Antonio, 197 last game of the night. You can look at Kyrie Irving, obviously in GPPs. This game should stay competitive. San Antonio, obviously, still a very good defensive team. Where I have the most interest in on the Boston side here is kind of taking a look at guys, like Jaylen Brown, kind of the secondary guys on this team who are a little bit cheaper, who don't need to hit as high to kind of produce, more value. So it's not a great spot for any of these Boston guys. I think there's obviously better guys to look at in this spot, but Jaylen Brown's obviously intriguing here. Rudy Gay is going to jump in the starting lineup. Not a great defender, obviously, at his age. Al Horford, coming off some really strong games. Won't be looking at him tonight. I mean, if you're building multiple lineups, I think you can obviously consider the Boston Celtics a little bit more. I have actually a little bit more interest in the San Antonio side. I like Rudy Gay here. You look at the DVP, obviously, against Boston kind of across the board. It's not great, but when you look at Rudy Gay, this is kind of what we want out of him. Playing 30-plus minutes. Usage rate was right around 22% last game. That's kind of fair. 5,200 on DK, really hard to pass up there. 63 on FanDuel, not bad either, where you got to roster two small forwards. Gay's going to be a guy that I look at quite a bit. As far as the other options go, it's going to be probably, LaMarcus Aldridge, obviously Pau Gasol are probably the most intriguing here. The backcourt's a little bit iffy with the full tank guys up point guards. So kind of staying away from the Ginobilis, the Patty Mills, the Murrays here in this spot. So going to look elsewhere. That's it for me. You can head over to DaveFantasyCafe.com, check out the great tools and content.